Hi there, everybody, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast. And today I want to share an AOP Live webinar interview that I conducted back in November of 2019 with Joe Yacura. So Joe is the former CPO of Fannie Mae, of IHG, Bank of America, and American Express. And Joe is also the founder at the International Association of Data Quality, Governance and Analytics. And he recently completed the third annual Supply Chain Data Quality and Governance study in partnership with Rob Handfield and his team at North Carolina State University and in partnership with iValuer. And so data is becoming an increasingly important challenge for procurement leaders looking to take their team to the next level. And so in this conversation, Joe and I discussed the findings of the report and most importantly, the actions that procurement teams can take to programmatically increase the quality of their data. The report that we refer to throughout the podcast is actually available right now, so you can go and get your copy immediately. You can do that by going to artofprocurement.com/data report. That's artofprocurement.com/data report. Okay, well, let's go into the podcast. So I started the conversation by asking Joe, why is data quality becoming such a big issue for procurement teams today?
As companies are becoming more and more dependent on data, want to use data in a totally different environment where they're actually going to have autonomous decision-making by systems based on the data accuracy, the quality, the relevance, the completeness, the timeliness, the context of the data, etc., are all critical in order to get an optimum answer or a set of directions. Mm-hmm. You see a lot of the companies now, they're being critical of their attempts to use AI. And the AI tools that we have today are truly outstanding. The problem is that the data that we use to train the neural nets in the AI are sometimes deficient or faulty. So a neural net learns based on the data that you provide to us. If the data is wrong, it learns incorrectly, and therefore it projects or predicts incorrect suggestions or outcomes. So this whole idea of data and its role is changing dramatically. That said, some companies are even, in some consulting firms, are even stating that we're in a data crisis. And I'm not sure I want to go to saying a crisis, but we have a serious challenge in front of us. And it's more of I think it's a crisis based on what your expectation is as to when you're going to reach a digital supply chain, right. Complete digital supply chain. If your expectation it's years off, then we have time to improve the data. If your expectation is to achieve this sometime in the next 12 to 18 months, I think most people will realize that that's probably not going to be achievable.
You know, you talked about timing, how oftentimes, we want to move quickly, but solving the data challenge that we have isn't something that you should have expectation that it's a quick fix. It's something that is really a long-term, it's you can't wave a magic wand, if you will, and all of a sudden all your data challenges are behind you.
That's correct. This is. I'm just going to give you some real high-end statistics from another study, kind of to set the tone, because the procurement function is not alone in this data challenge. So, this estimated that, and this is I'm talking business to business data, not business to consumer, but business to business. It's estimated that on a daily basis is like 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. So the amount of data is phenomenal. No company is prepared to handle that volume, right? Mm-hmm. It says that this study also, the Harvard Business Review, found that 18% of the businesses connect to over 15 data sources in making a decision. Okay? And 9% have no idea how many sources they currently pull from.
Right.
So people are starting to getting their hands around how do we make these decisions, where's the data coming from, et cetera. In our study, when I get to our study, I identify some of those same issues. We have so much data now that's coming through the IoT, all the sensors that are on manufacturing and logistics companies and freight and things of that nature. It's totally overwhelming. 77% of companies believe that they've lost revenue because of inaccurate or incomplete data. So these numbers are astronomical. One of the things that, so those are studies, and people say, yeah, studies, that's interesting, but kind of so what? Well, I'll just give you a couple other quick examples before we get into our study. The FDA, and these examples I'm going to be giving you are all occurred within the last 2 weeks. So this is something that didn't happen in 2017 or 18, within the last 2 weeks. The FDA announced that there's 120 critical prescription drugs that are in short supply because of poor data.
Right.
This is crazy, right? 3 or 4 days ago, the Indian government stated that they cannot produce their consumer expenditure survey due to poor data quality. And that's what the marketeers in the country of India use to forecast demand and everything else, right? Baltimore, the city of Baltimore, in the last 2 weeks has identified that they can't keep up with the demand. They have 70 data sets that they provide to consumers, or to their citizens.
Yeah.
Only 6% are automated, and they're even questioning the quality of those.
Right.
And most important here, recently, a week ago, the U.S. Air Force said that because of poor data, they didn't realize that they had 120 million of aircraft parts that showed up on no system because the system was siloed. And we want to talk about that later on, about siloed data. So without good data, you cannot have any kind of expectation to really achieve any level of digitization. It's impossible. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say is, we talked when we did the preparation, it was a story that stuck in my mind as well about, your experience at the executive level within procurement and outside of procurement. You're making decisions on a daily basis and you're making a lot of decisions. You don't really know if the data that is informing those decisions, is that you're making those decisions based on good data.
You're absolutely correct. And most of the time, I'm sure many people on this call here too also have been in meetings. If somebody presents data, and you may or may not ask about the sources of the data. You're just looking at the compilation of the data, right? And so many times, as we all know, we've been involved with basing business decisions based on data that's a summary of a summary of a summary, some of which is out of the same time frame that you're looking, used in a different context. Data dictionaries are important, and most companies do not have data dictionaries, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So the terminology may be misleading, and therefore you come up with either a wrong decision or a sub-optimized decision.
So let's go. I want to quickly start to touch on some of the things you talked about there. But before I do, just to give folks a little bit of perspective onto the study itself, could you talk a little bit about what it is, the kind of folks who participated in the study, and maybe a little bit about the history of kind of where you've got to today?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first off, I think we owe a lot to Evaluate for sponsoring this study, because they have the vision and the foresight and the understanding that data is critical, no matter what you do. So I'd like to thank them for that effort. This is their third annual study, obviously 2017, 18, and 19. The study is led by Dr. Robert Handfield and myself, with some assistance of some of his doctoral students at North Carolina State University. This year, we were very excited. We were able to get participation from almost all the large, major professional supply chain associations in the world. So this year, we were extremely pleased that we think this is the most thorough and complete survey of this subject that exists today. We had 876 participants who responded to our survey. Not all of the questions were responded to by each participant, so the sample size varies on each question, but it's very robust. And these participants, in total, their companies spend about $300 billion a year with third parties. So it's a great representation, and we're really pleased with the outcome. If I go into the study a little bit quickly here, just for a minute, if that's where you want to go, or do you have another question?
No, I was going to ask you about some of the findings of the study, so please, you're one step ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So let me just comment. Overall, we're not surprised, but the progress that's been made over the last 12 months and 24 months, if we compare it to the 2017 study, are incremental, but not necessarily significant. The trending is in the right way, and as I give you some specific examples, we can talk about it. So there are improvements being made, but they're very slow. And the procurement function still, in our opinion, lags some of the other disciplines like finance or marketing and sales in using data and cleaning their data. one of the interesting things was, and I'll talk this here in a second with the questions and the answers. It looks like there's an overall improvement in the data quality. So the degree of improvement increased considerably. Our study here shows that last year there was about a 30% increase in the quality of the data, but the overall rating of quality of data is still very low.
Right.
One of the things that was very interesting too in this year's study is we asked the question, how much time do you spend, what percentage of your day do you spend in looking for data? This is a very interesting trend from 2019 into 2018. In 2019, more than 25%, there's people who spent more than 25% of their time to looking for data was at 16%. Compared to 2018, the people who spent more than 25% of their time looking for data was at 2%.
Wow.
So it's kind of interesting if you look at, data, cleaning data, organizing data, and then using the data, analyzing the data. It looks like there's a higher degree of confidence in the quality, but now as they're using data in different ways, they're being more precise, and the data is not organized or categorized in a way that they can find the data.
Right.
When you think it's 25%, it's been this 16% of the responders spend more than 25% of the day looking for data. That's a huge overhead cost.
Yeah. And that's because they can't find what they're. That's because there's access to so much data now, and they can't necessarily find what they're looking for.
Exactly, and that goes back to this concept of creating a data dictionary. And I want to deviate a little bit from the study, but this is kind of one of the underlying issues that needs to be addressed in procurement functions and any function. You need to create a data dictionary, and what we mean by that is you need to create a set of definitions that is common to all the parties either creating the data or using the data. And when we look at terms, some places, even within a company, if you're multiple divisions, the definitions that are used in reporting can vary, whether it be vary in unit size, specifications, etc. And then when you're dealing with your outside suppliers, who knows what their definition of that term is. So one of the major challenges of most companies is to create and it doesn't have to be complicated, you start simply, but defining definitions that we'll use when we address and use data and we create metrics around performance. That is a fundamental issue that's missing. Everyone wants to talk about working on the greatest algorithm or buying the greatest software or whatever because that's sexy and exciting. And those tools all work extrememely well. They really do. It's the data that goes into them affects the output. And that is not something that's exciting to do. It's a lot of grunt work. When you look at the studies, in ours and others too, about we have data analysts, we have data scientists, and we have data engineers. So data analysts are probably what most of us on this call deal with. They're individuals who help us interpret the data. They're probably really good in using tools like Excel or Power BI and things of that nature. Data scientists are those people who are developing algorithms for more sophisticated data analytics and statistical analysis. And then you have data engineers who are really focused on providing the network. The data engineers are really the people who really reside more in the IT function. When we look at what is a data analyst, how does he or she spend her time? Study after study after study, including ours, says that they can spend anywhere from a minimum of 60% to 80% of their time just cleaning the data. So it's a huge, in essence, waste of their time or expense. It has to be done. Because the quality is so bad, it's inconsistent, etc., it has to be done in order to try to use the tool to get something that's effective.
So one of the questions on that point that we had from an audience member from Taj was, what are some of the best practices for normalizing data? You talked about the idea of a data dictionary. What are those that are doing this the most effectively?
Yeah, it's as simple as creating a data dictionary, but again, kind of, I'm reading in between the lines on that question, and I may or may not be answering this person's question appropriately. But one of the real big challenges here is, the time frame that people have to make decisions is usually typically very short. It could be seconds, minutes, hours, days.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually not weeks or months. And without having that data clean and having a set of defined definitions of the data, it's very hard to get any kind of results. One of the other things too is that most companies do not do, and I'd highly recommend that they consider doing this if they haven't already, is creating a data audit.
Mm-hmm.
And a data audit is not a security audit. It's an audit and aligned with some sort of data governance. Because what happens is most people don't know where their data necessarily is coming from. They don't know how old it is. They don't know the context that it was taken. They don't know the quality, the consistency, etc. You have to create a data audit to get confidence from the end user and using that data to draw conclusions and recommendations. So a data audit is critical. Most companies, when we bring that up, it's kind of a blank stare,
Mm-hmm.
because they think that, well, we just had an audit, but it was a data security audit.
Yeah. It's
not a map.
So it's like the usefulness of the data.
The usefulness, the accuracy, how I can use it, etc. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's issues about how long do you keep data for. Again, we mentioned this gazillion kind of a daily influx of data.
Now there's no incremental cost of storing additional data, so now we just keep everything.
Right, we keep everything, and in essence, it doesn't get used or it's aged. There's a term that they use called black data. It's commonly referred to in the industry. And this black data is data that's typically been in possession of a company for 5 years, but never has been reviewed. We consider that black data. And if you look at data, all data has a shelf life. It's almost like a perishable good, right? It's only good for a certain time frame if you're really going to take tactical actions. Historical data might be interesting to help with a strategy, but even there you have to be sensitive to the way the markets change so quickly today, demand, supply changes, tariffs, foreign exchange rates, environmental impacts, depends on what industry you're in. Most data, in my opinion, with most companies, especially in the supply chain, I think that if you're using data that's 6 months or older, it's probably not relative to the business or the decision you're trying to make, because our businesses are moving so quickly and we have so many external influences on our business and the supply chain that I think 6 months old data is probably not relevant.
What would you say? So one of the things that jumps to my mind when you talk about that is, historically and traditionally, from a procurement perspective, when we look at spend analytics, we're always looking at least a 12-month picture of our spend. Now, how does that kind of mesh with the idea that, well, if data is more than 6 months old, it might not be as, I don't want to say it's not worth anything, because that's not, I think, what you try to say, but that it's not as relevant to you.
It has diminishing value. A diminishing value. And I think, unless you're looking at something that's very stable, some like MRO type of supplies that are a function of more the population of a company or something, that's probably going to stay the same. If it's driven by outside dynamics in the marketplace, I think 6 months or longer is questionable as far as the incremental value of that data. We're working in such a high-speed environment today. And that's why it goes back to the data has to be right, because you can't waste time cleaning the data and then categorizing it and then trying to make a decision. You've lost the opportunity if you have to follow that.
The data is already old.
Exactly. And, the velocity of what we're getting and the volume of the data that we're getting is dramatically improving every day. I'm not saying that all that data is valuable, but if you have to weed through it to find out where the values are, so you really have to use, these tools are great, but you also have to, in my opinion, use some statistical analysis, like, adjusted R-square and stuff, technology, or statistical techniques like this, to identify those independent variables that influence the dependent variable. And you have to do some of that statistical analysis of your data first to make sure that you're looking at the right input to make those decisions. And just using conventional R squared statistical analysis, it doesn't get it. You got to use adjusted R because that helps identify and narrow in on those independent variables that really do influence the output.
Right.
So,
no, please go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. So there's so much going on. I mean, if we look at our survey, and I'm going to go back to our survey again here because I want to talk about that throughout our discussion here, and I know we have limited time. The question was, are you capable of finding clean data? Only 32% of our responders said yes. 68% said no. That's not much movement from 2018 to 2019 if you compare study to study. On the question of data completeness, only 14% of the respondents said they're confident in the data that they have. And then another question was, so that's complete data. The other question was data accuracy. And again, only 14% said they're confident in the accuracy of the data. So when you look at these numbers, and we said, we had another question is, what is the overall data quality, your perception of it? 63% said that their assessment of the data quality was fair to poor. 9% said it was excellent, and 28% said it was good. So good and excellent made up 37% of the responses. This is not bode well for functions that are going to try to digitize their whole function, right?
So we have a problem in terms of, obviously, the importance of the data and the gap between where our data is today. And I'm going to ask a question. Before I do, I just want to ask anybody who's listening on the line, if you do have questions, please pop them in the chat box or the question section of GoToWebinar. And Kelly's going to come, keep an eye on those. I'm going to come to Kelly as well in a moment. But I had a question about, it's something we talked about before we hit the start button here, about value, attributing a value to data. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about kind of the idea of contributing value to it that then helps deliver or position an ROI of investing in fixing some of these problems and challenges that we talked about.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. Most companies do not establish a value for the data. They don't put a numerical value on the data that they collect, store, and use. Which is very challenging because the accounting profession, and you look at the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, FASB, and all the other regulatory agencies that influence accounting, they have raised the question over the years about how do we establish a numeric value for the data that we have. When you look at companies like Facebook, Google, all these companies, Amazon, the value of the data is astronomical. You can't it's hard to quantify because they are data-driven, information-driven companies. Yet, when you look at a balance sheet for a corporation, even these, there's no quantitative value associated or consistent way of establishing the value. So, if you can't establish a value, and that if we could do this somehow, create a value that we can actually put on a balance sheet in a financial statement, that would draw a lot of attention and senior executive focus, saying, well, wait a minute, we have how many hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars on the balance sheet associated with the data. Who's managing it? How do we refresh it? The next question is, if you look at it from just from an accounting standpoint, is what kind of depreciation method do we use to depreciate the value? Because again, we were saying earlier, it has a shelf life. So over time, that value has a diminishing value to us. How do we depreciate on a balance sheet data? So this is a very interesting challenge. Everybody recognizes it's something that needs to be addressed, because if we're not stating the value of that data in the balance sheet, we're either understating or overstating the value of the company, especially if it's publicly traded. As we all know, there's a whole bunch of requirements that need to be met. So I hope I answered your question. It is an area that needs to be addressed. It's been recognized for a while, but I don't see anybody making any major inroads in how to do this from an accounting perspective.
So I guess trying to bring it down to a granular level in procurement and supply chain, how you've obviously been involved in a lot of companies yourself. You see and talk to a lot of companies through the work that you're doing with NC State and the study. How are procurement and supply chain leaders making the business case that an investment in cleansing, improving data quality is an investment that's worth making?
Yeah, I think it's hard for them, to be very honest with you, because they can't quantify it.
Yeah.
You know, what is there's very few companies, and I can't even give you any good examples. I've talked to people who are fringing on it, who try to identify and associate a cost associated with bad data.
Right.
Most procurement functions are so overwhelmed with just trying to keep the business running and they know intuitively the procurement people are smart people, just like any other function, but they don't have the bandwidth to address this. And that's why I think some of these things have to be addressed at an enterprise level. And what I say that is, in our survey shows here, and I'll just try to find the example, the statistic here for you, but many companies now are starting data governance committees and councils, and it's very exciting that procurement is starting to become as a chair on these data governance committees. So if we look at by industry, the consulting and professional services, 22% of the responses to our survey in that area had a procurement representative on the data governance committee. Education at 18, energy and gas at 16. So procurement is now starting to come to be part of the enterprise decision making on this data governance, which is absolutely critical for going forward and will help them justify the investment.
Who typically owns data governance then? If procurement is now getting a seat at the table, whose table is it?
Another great question. It's very hard to find who owns data in a company. And then again, a governance committee and decisions would help define that. In my opinion, procurement should own the data. In my opinion, procurement should own the interpretation, the cleansing, and the categorization of the data. And the reason why I say that is the IT functions have basically changed a lot over the last 5 years or decade. They do a great job of securing data, making access available, controlling the access to the data, etc. An IT function cannot be, in my opinion, held accountable to interpret data from a procurement perspective.
Right.
They don't have the bandwidth either to say this is important and we're only getting 80% accuracy here, so we need to focus on that. So I would like to see, and again, our surveys, when we ask the question, is there a person in your procurement, supply chain function, whatever term you want to use, who is actually responsible for the data? Most of the answers, the vast majority, are we never thought about that, or we do not have one. That's not saying the innovators do have. There are people. Again, I have to be careful when I say these because there are people doing great things, but the vast majority don't have the bandwidth or the time. So until you can own the data, you have to be careful though, because our survey also shows that over 20% of the people who have started to create and own the data are siloing the data. That is not good either. Because data should be shared to other functions. So isolating is just like the earlier example here I gave of the Air Force, $120 million worth of aircraft parts were not identified. It was a siloed database that nobody knew existed.
So Kelly, I promise I am going to come to you in a second, but I just had a follow-up. We talked about procurement starting to own the data. Procurement not necessarily knowing who in procurement should own the data. Where do you see that person sitting that takes responsibility and accountability in those organizations that are taking responsibility and accountability for cleansing procurement data? Is it the CPO? Is it procurement excellence? Where does that person sit?
It's not the CPO because he or she has a whole bunch of management, other management responsibility. Whether it sits in a business control group within a supply chain function, if you have it or not, some people don't have those sorts of organizations. It definitely, this person, this individual, he or she should definitely report directly to the CPO.
Right.
Because that data and the quality of that data is going to drive the decision that the procurement or supply chain function, the decisions that they make. And in today's world, we have to be more data-driven, and therefore it has to be put at a highest level within the supply chain function.
One, to demonstrate its importance, but two, because the CPO, it's critical for the CPO to effectively do their job.
Absolutely. And you know, as you go up in the chain of command in any company, regardless of its size or the discipline it's in, you become more and more dependent upon the people around you, and those people need to have good data, because you, in most cases, don't have time to scrutinize the data to the extent you'd probably want to.
Right.
So again, it comes to a faith credibility issue.
Yeah.
And that data has to be as solid as possible and as current and relevant as possible. And therefore, you have to have this person, in my opinion, report directly to the Chief Procurement Officer.
Okay, thank you. So Kelly, did you have any questions that have come in? I'm sorry I haven't broken to you until now, but
I do, as a matter of fact. And actually, it's funny because the questions that are coming in are so on point with what you're discussing in the moment. I'm like slightly modifying the questions here as you pick off little pieces of them. So I think the one of the most pressing questions, based on what you've just been discussing, comes in from Susan. And Joseph, this is to your point about procurement lagging behind the other functions around the management of data quality, partially because we are so focused on the day-to-day and transactions and getting work done, and we just simply don't have the bandwidth to invest in improving and managing the quality of our data. So what Susan is asking is, given that bandwidth is the problem, if we're going to fix the problem, does the solution look like hiring a data scientist or data analyst into procurement? Does it look like a technology solution for improving the quality of data? Does it look like an outside or third-party service provider that can help improve data quality? How do we look to start filling in that bandwidth that we need and closing the gap?
Yeah, well, another great question. Obviously, it depends on the company and what they're capable of doing. My bias would be, initially, if you could afford to bring in a data analyst, not a scientist, but a data analyst. Now, this is the lowest level from a sophistication standpoint of data, but you need to start somewhere. So start to grunt force, go through what is the critical data you use, start to make sure it's clean, it's accurate, it's organized, etc. If you have the benefit of using a third party, that will obviously accelerate your ability to make progress around cleaning and establishing some governance. But there's so much low-hanging fruit in most companies that it could be done. You have to do this, though. I don't see this as a choice. I see this as a requirement, because if procurement doesn't advance and the other functions within the companies advance and improve data and use AI and other machine learning tools, etc., procurement is basically going to be left in the dust. And one suggestion I would make is, there shouldn't be any pride of authorship. I would ask procurement people to go across the hall and talk to your marketing people and other functions who are doing a lot with data. They may have some tools, techniques, some guidance that could help you. They probably have already bought or licensed the software tools to help clean up the data. So why not just tag on to those agreements? So I don't think this is a go alone approach. I think go and tap into whatever resources you have within your company or within your professional organization to try to accelerate this as quick as possible. But again, just closing point on this question is, this is not an option. I don't know how to stress that enough. This has to be done, and it has to be done as quick as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really funny, Joe, because I think the audio interference we were getting earlier was actually from Joe's ESP, because the next question that I was going to ask is, if procurement is lagging, what other functions in the organization should we look to for advice, for leadership, for perspective, right? So you've just mentioned that marketing tends to be relatively data savvy, that their quality tends to be better. And not in all cases, but in many organizations, procurement and marketing don't have a naturally easy working relationship already in place. Are there other functions, either other functions that you would recommend that we look at. Certainly we can look at marketing, and maybe that's a possibility. But if we don't already have a good working relationship in place with marketing, is there either another function that you would recommend we go work with, or B, how do we figure out sort of function regardless? Who is doing the best job in the company currently managing the data that they have? How can we figure that out without going around to every team and asking, so how are you on data quality?
Yeah, I think an easy place to start would be to go and ask these other functions, and within the company, if we're just staying with that approach for right now, who has somebody in charge of data quality, and can you talk to that person? Because he or she will tell you what tools they're using, what the source of data. They'll tell you what they run into, and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, especially within a company, to do this effort, because everybody is undertaking. So I would, again, it's a keep it simple kind of concept. Go over and say, hey, the CPO should talk to the head of marketing. Okay, wait, do you have somebody in charge of data quality and or your data? The other function that you may want to go to is your quality organization. Sometimes you'll be surprised they're not as quality focused internally as they may be with some of the other charters that they have, but you can start there also. When you look at finance is kind of along the same lines, I think, in my opinion, as procurement. They maybe have touched some tools better, but I didn't give as an example earlier, but the federal government has 96 different agencies, and they have to give an annual report on how they spend their money. Simple, what you would think was a simple approach. Last year, 11 of the 96 agencies, or 10%, could not meet the reporting requirements. This is crazy. And that's an improvement, because the year before that, it was 24 of the 96 agencies couldn't meet the reporting requirements. So this is not just unique to procurement. It's an enterprise-wide, government-wide, whatever. Everybody's struggling with this.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't mean to deviate too much from that person's question, but hopefully we answered it to some degree, given some ideas.
No, I think you did. And if we kind of stay on the idea, I have a question here from Sean that I think dovetails nicely with what you were just saying. You had mentioned that basically everyone has a problem with data. And within any given organization, there's probably only going to be a few specific people, if anyone, right, that truly has any either expertise or ownership over data quality. So yes, we can hire someone, we can work with service providers, we can leverage technology, but if we're both trying to have a pinpointed solution and make sure that everyone understands that every single person has a role to play in improving and ensuring data quality, what would you recommend around broader either educational investments or talent development? How do we start to, almost like a public service announcement, right? How do we start talking about more broadly educating people broadly so that everyone that touches data, who's everyone, really does start to be invested in and has an awareness of how important data quality is?
Yeah, that again, another great question. In our 2019 study, we did not ask a question that we asked in our 2017 and 18. And that question was, how much was the procurement function spending on training their people on how to understand data and perform data analytics? We did not ask that question in 2019, but I'll tell you what we found in 2017 and 18. In all the studies, all the CPOs, when we ask about the importance of data, they all say it's a critical function, it needs to be performed, etc. A very interesting statistic, from 2017 to 2018, when we asked the question about how much were you spending to train your people, the dollars committed to training went down.
Interesting.
Which is counterintuitive to they're saying this is a critical function. They said we don't have the skills, but at the same time, we're decreasing our expenditure. Now, we did not ask that question in 2019. In hindsight, we'll ask in 2020. But a very interesting response. So you can draw some conclusions. Were they thinking of maybe outsourcing this function? It's a speculation. We don't know. We're just making broad assumptions of there. Were they thinking there was going to be a technology solution that they could acquire and would perform the function and wouldn't have to make the investment in the training of their staff? We don't know because we didn't ask a follow-on question. We just asked the top-level question. So what people need to do is they need to find, most procurement organizations today have, well-educated people who have, advanced degrees and things of that nature, who have some understanding of statistics, have some understanding of process analysis, etc. Tap into, understand what you have first before you quickly go out to hire somebody else or, outsource this to someone. Look internal, and this is a great opportunity for some of your high-performing people to jump on and help you advance in this area. You don't have to have a PhD in statistics or things of that nature to make major progress in this area. Mm-hmm. So I would look internal first, see if you have any candidates you could tap into. I think you have to understand, though, if you're going to assign someone to do this job, this can't be a 10% of their time.
Right.
This has to be a dedicated person. And if you have any hopes of digitizing the supply chain, you have to start internally first. And I think what most companies will find is they have a considerable amount of work to do internally before they can really start to legitimately say they have a digitized supply chain. If saying you have a digitized supply chain means you get everything electronically and not paper form, well, that's, in my mind, not a digital supply chain. Mm-hmm. It has some interfaces that are electronic, but the use and benefit you gain from that data is probably minimal, if any.
Thank you, Kelly. Anything else come in, or if not, I will switch over to the last couple of questions I have here.
The good news and the bad news is that there's about 1 million questions that have come in. So I would say, based on what the clock says, why don't you go ahead with the questions that we had pulled together for the end, and that'll give us plenty of things to discuss with Joe after we get off the line today.
Yeah, and actually, because of the time, I just wanted to wrap up with one last question. So Kelly, if you do have time to pick one out, please feel free to do so. If not, I will just run with my last question for Joe to wrap up.
Yes. Great. So as I look then at the questions that have come in, let's see, whose lucky day am I going to make? So I guess the other question that really stands out to me as something that will have broad appeal, Joe, in terms of your answer, is to what extent should we be looking at data quality as a standalone issue? And to what extent do we have to really force ourselves to hunker down and deal with some of the nagging issues, like, for instance, procurement's inability to move away from Excel, right? I mean, you talked about siloed data ownership. That almost seems to pale in comparison to the problems associated with siloed data creation, things that are living on people's local machines that aren't standardized, that aren't centralized. How much do we need to ask of ourselves on an individual and functional basis to really start step-by-step making some of these big changes?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and it's interesting they brought up the question of Excel. Excel is obviously the workhorse for everything that procurement does, including data cleansing, etc. It's very interesting that we saw from 2018 to 2019 a decrease in the use of identifying Excel as your primary tool. That said, in 2019, 37% of the respondents said that Excel is their primary tool. Which is down from around 60% or something the previous year. And what we found is a shift, not a major shift, but a shift of increasing to use tools like Tableau and Power BI to visualize, which is critical. To convey a message, you really, in most cases, you need to visualize the data. So we're starting to see a slight change to that. I don't think we're ever going to take away Excel as being the safety net to use, because it's so convenient, it's readily available, etc. We're not seeing major advances in using more advanced data analytics software like R or Python, which your data scientists would be using. Now, again, maybe it's because our audience is more of the data analysts and the procurement people, and maybe not the data scientists. So we didn't see a lot of movement in the more advanced statistical software tools, but we did see a decrease in Excel, but a slight increase in visualization tools. We have to make this commitment, though. I mean, this is not an option, and I can't stress that enough. we have a significant challenge ahead of us as a procurement profession. If we're going to be recognized and continue to play a critical role in our companies, we have to embrace advanced technologies and data analytics, but we have to start with cleaning the data and then creating some sort of governance around the data. I mean, some of my suggestions, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but one of the key things I'd like to leave the people who are on the call here with us is a couple of thoughts. You definitely need to start to address, or if you have one, enhance your data audits. That's absolutely critical. Where's your data coming from? How valid is it? Are you paying for it? Who uses it? How is it used, etc.? You need to create an internal and external data dictionary. And again, don't worry about having it perfect. Start and you'll evolve it, right? But somehow between yourselves internally and with your supply chain partners, agree on a set of terms. So when you get the data, you all know if it means the same thing. You need to develop a governance plan around data aging. How long do you keep data, and how old of the data will you accept being incorporated into a decision-making process? You may set up a guideline. It can't be more than 3 months old, 6 months old, whatever. It can only be from these qualified sources, whatever. You also need to develop a governance plan for algorithm aging, because as we start to use algorithms and artificial intelligence and machine learning tools, if you're at that stage, the algorithms are only relevant to the data set that it looked at when it was created. And many companies create an algorithm and think they're going to sit on that algorithm for a year or more. That is misleading. You have to reassess the algorithm and make sure it still is relevant based on the data that you currently have. You have to make the difference between historical data and transaction data. And a lot of times we make business decisions, and I think, Phil, I meant to comment earlier, you made some comment, I forget the context it was in, but, we can't make business decisions going forward typically on historical data. We want recent transaction data. You just have to make a differentiation. I think a lot of people say, okay, what are we going to do next year? Well, let's look at last year's data. Well, last year's data may not have any relevance to the decision that needs to be made 6 months from now. We need to obtain, obviously, cleaner data, establish a government, etc. Very interesting. I want to go back to one other thing in our study here. It says, where do you get most of your data from? And only 24% of our responders said that they get the majority of the data from their ERP system, which is very interesting. I would have expected that to be much higher. So the question is why aren't they using more of the data? Don't they trust the data? What is it that it's only 24% of the respondents are using that as their primary source of data in the supply chain?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know, Joe, we have come to the top of the hour, and actually you finished off by answering the question I was going to ask, which was some of the takeaways. So there's a lot of really great takeaways that you provided to everybody. I'm sorry for everybody at the beginning where we had the issues with the audio quality, but thank you very much for sticking with us, because so many insights. For attendees, we will, once the final report, the survey is ready for publication, we will send that along to all of you as well, so that you can get all the insights behind what Joe shared with us. Hi everybody, it's Phil here. So as we wrapped up the webinar, I just referenced the data quality and governance report that we previewed. As I mentioned right at the beginning in my introduction, that report is now available. You can get your copy by going to artofprocurement.com/data report. That's artofprocurement.com/data report.